This is definitely one of my favorite chapters of Animal Farm. It always leads to a really interesting discussion in the live classes when I teach it to students that are actually in front of me. So I hope that you get a little bit of a sliver of that from me today, because really the best part of this chapter is the debate that could come after. So your assignment with this chapter is actually to have that discussion with your family, but let's talk about what the discussion should be first. I want to talk with you about the idea of diversity and equality in government. Now, it's really nice for the animals to say that all animals are equal, but the fact of the matter is, and it's very obvious to tell, they're really not. It's not possible for chickens to pull a plow. The horses can, but the chickens can't. And they have a very physical excuse. It's not a secret to anybody, even to the animals on the farm, that the chickens just can't do the same things the horses can. But when you put this in people terms, remember this book is meant to be in some ways a symbol of the pitfalls of our own society if we're not careful, it becomes a little bit trickier. Because as much as we would like to admit that everybody is equal, our definition of equal might need a little bit of adjusting when you consider that sometimes people are different, and not really sometimes, but all the time, people are different. Think about your siblings. Some of your siblings probably have strengths that you really wish you had, and some of them probably have weaknesses that you're really glad you don't have. And I bet if you talk to them, they would probably say, you know, this is something that I really wish that you do well, that I really wish I could do. So everybody's a little bit different, and it's not really a secret to anybody, especially in your family. You know what people are good at and not so good at. In my house, everybody knew that I was really good at kind of the nitty-gritty academics part of school. I'm very organized. It's very easy for me to take notes, for example, and to pass a test. I did well in my math classes even though it was hard for me because I knew how to organize. Now, my brother was a little bit different. My brother is not organized at all, and he doesn't like normal academic classes, and whereas I succeed on principle because that's just kind of who I am, he's a little bit more rebellious and says, you know, if I don't really care about this, then why am I going to waste my time? And so he focused his attention on stuff that he cared about, which I actually really admire about him in his defense. So he did really well in music and arts classes, and not really so well in the kind of mainstream academic classes. So, obviously, we're very different people, but we're still related, and we should still be treated equally, right? Well, sometimes maybe not. Sometimes maybe people need an exception. For example, somebody who's in a wheelchair, or is very ill, or is maybe a pregnant woman, should they have the opportunity to park closer to the grocery store? Well, yeah. I think that's probably a good idea, and I think that you probably think it's a pretty good idea too, but that's a pretty simple one. What about some of the more complicated things, like, for example, disability insurance? Should a deaf person who can communicate perfectly well and can succeed very well in school, should they be allowed to have a handicap pass for the bus when they can walk and communicate just as well as anybody else? They just do it a little differently. I actually had an ASL teacher when I was at college who was very frustrated by this because she said, you know, deaf people aren't any different. We just communicate differently. I don't like that some of my friends are taking money from the government. But some of you might be thinking, well, no, that's fair. Like, they can't hear, so they should get a little bit of extra help. And then at the same time, some of you might be thinking, well, it's not fair that they get a little extra help when I don't get a little extra help on things like that. Sometimes I just don't feel good, and I don't want to have to walk that far to get to my groceries. I just want to go in and grab my medicine and leave. I don't want to have to walk that far. I should be able to use that parking spot. So sometimes I think our idea of diversity and equality can get a little bit messy when we start realizing that diversity doesn't just come in the form of physical disabilities or mental disabilities, but in sometimes like weird combinations of the two. And the real problem comes when you start figuring out, okay, well, who decides? Who decides if a person needs extra help? Is it the government's job to decide to just give specific groups of people disability or not? My ASL teacher thought that the government should stay well out of it. They shouldn't force her to take handicap passes. Now, she didn't have one, and they're, as far as I know, not forcing her, but she also thought that none of her friends should have the option. Now, is that fair? I don't know. All of this stuff, at least to me, is really interesting. So what I would like for you to do is to talk about this with your family. What do your parents think about how diversity and equality work together, particularly when it comes to assistance from the government